Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is qualitative interviewing as it relates to conducting your needs assessment assignment. So, in order to be able to accurately identify a need in among a population of focus, we're going to have some really profound and robust interviewing skills. So today we are going to go over that whole process of collecting qualitative data, particularly focused on building our qualitative interviewing skills and developing our interview guide so that we are really having similar types of conversations amongst our three participants in our population of focus. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Okay, so focus on qualitative interviewing for needs assessment. My name is Dr. Leslie Harris. I'm an associate professor at the Kent School of Social Work and Family Science, and I teach a lot about qualitative methods. I actually teach a series in our PhD program that's a year long about qualitative data collection and analysis. So this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. Okay, so let's give an outline and some of our objectives. So we're going to talk about the steps and stages of qualitative data collection. We're going to talk about developing an effective interview guide for your projects, for your needs assessment projects. We're going to explore interviewing skills. There's going to be some practice exercises that are going to be linked to your discussion board exercise for this week. We're going to talk about interviewing challenges and dynamics of interviewing. And then we're going to discuss maybe a hotter topic or debate in the field about online versus in-person interviews and which one is best and what is acceptable. My experience is that both are acceptable. It's just there's some things to keep in mind when interviewing online as it is quite newer in the scope of our field, in the scope of the longevity of our field in qualitative interviewing. And this really changed during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the good thing is that we've been able to really develop some online skills to be able to effectively interview people for needs assessments and other qualitative projects to be able to ensure that we're following, best practices and protocols. So we're going to end there for today. So I've also linked some additional resources that can be found in this week's course content. I really want you to review interview processes best practices template that I put together. I also want you to look at the interview guide development template. This will help you kind of plug and play your topic and population of focus and the organization that you're working with as a starting place to develop your own interview guide for your needs assessment projects. We're also going to focus on the do's and don'ts of qualitative interviewing, which is from Kathy Sharma's book, Constructing Grounded Theory. She focuses on a process called intensive interviewing, and I think she has some just really helpful tips about posturing and positionality in relationship to being an effective qualitative interviewer. So please review those for this week. So, somewhat additional objectives is that we really want to increase your understanding of the role in qualitative interviewing in needs assessments. We want you to gain some interviewing skills to carry out your needs assessment project effectively and really understand some of the common challenges and solutions that often arise in qualitative interviewing. Lastly, this will help you really gain familiarity about the process and to help you develop your protocol through walking through these different research steps. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the basics. What even is a qualitative interview? I'm going to quote Kathy Sharma's and saying that it should be a gently guided, one-way conversation with a purpose. And as interviews, we should be talking very little, and our participant should be talking a lot. It is really a space where power is shared. And I would even say, ideally, it would be tipped in the direction, the power dynamic would be tipped in the direction where your participant is more powerful than us as the researchers or the interviewers. The conversation is with a specially selected participant within our population of focus. So, participant that knows a lot about our topic of focus. And it's going to be a discussion focused on a specific topic. And ideally, our participant will know what that topic is before the interview is conducted and maybe gain more information about that as the interview is being set up so that they can be as helpful as they can in terms of helping us understand and identify the need. So it's a conversation with a planned structure and ideally should be a comfortable, trusting, and respectful space. So as researchers, we are in the role of being the interviewer. So we need to understand what is interviewing. And so I just want you to challenge yourself for a moment to think about all the types of interviews that are available in this wild world that we live in. So I would often venture to say we live in an interview society, meaning that interviewing is very normalized and integrated into our day-to-day lives. Like I listen to podcast interviews on and NPR and news stations and celebrity interviews. And I'm really interested in memoirs and authors. And so I feel like at times I'm listening to people being interviewed from sunup till sundown. So we need to really think also about how interviewing at times is a performance. On television, we see a lot of interviews. So we need to think about some images and examples for interviews that you are familiar with, and think about how interviewing is on in media versus what interviewing is like for the sake of research. I also want you to challenge yourself and think about who are some of your favorite interviewers in the podcast that you're going to listen to for this week's course content. That's one of the questions that is asked to the expert that's interviewed on qualitative interviewing. And I think some of her answers are quite surprising. So think about some of these qualities and characteristics that you think make an interviewer great at their job. I'm going to talk for a moment about the process of collecting data. And I'm going to cite John Cresswell's book on this, which isn't a part of your assigned readings, but just to give him his due citation. So he thinks about qualitative data collection really as a cycle rather than a linear process because we're constantly going out in the field interviewing people and then coming back and analyzing, going out and interviewing again, coming back and analyzing. So we need to think thoughtfully through each of these steps. So we're first locating a site and an individual. So we're thinking about the organization we're partnering with for our needs assessment. We're thinking about what key people within that organization we want to interview or who might be willing to partner with us. We want to gain access to that organization and build rapport. My advice to students at this step is go with an organization you are familiar with. We are going to be challenged pretty quickly with collecting data for this class project. So we want you to go with an agency or organization that you're quite familiar with so that you have that access. You want to purposively engage in sampling, meaning that you want to identify people that have these shared characteristics, knowledge of, or participation in the organization or the institution or the community that you're partnering with. We want to collect data. So we're going out and we're collecting interview data. We want to think thoughtfully about recording information in the form of a recording device or we're audio recording so that we can then later transcribe our interview. We want to think about resolving issues and challenges that we're having in the field. Sometimes this has to do back with like gaining access or building rapport. And then we're going to think about storing data. So what are we doing with our interview transcripts? What are we doing with our recordings so that then we can move forward and analyze them? So again, this happens a lot in a cycle, and we often jump iteratively between these different steps. Next, I want to talk about the steps for actually interviewing. You want to decide your overall research question or aim of your needs assessment. Then you want to develop your interview guide based on those questions. Then you want to your interviewees and the type of interview. We're going to focus on an interviewing style by Kathy Sharma called intensive interviewing, meaning that we're looking at meaning making and action. We're going to shore up our recording procedures. So we need to just decide what device we are going to record on. It's so interesting that we live in a technological age where we can literally just record participants on our cell phones. I like to use still like to use a handheld recording device, but that for this class assignment is up to you. We want to use an interview protocol with our interview guide. We want to pilot test as well before we go out and do this for real, because sometimes questions don't land the way we think they're going to land. We're going to determine a place for that interview. Maybe it's online via Zoom or Teams. Maybe it's face-to-face in person. One of the most important elements of that is that we really want to ensure confidentiality and privacy and an interview space that we don't have a lot of interruptions. We are then going to ask for consent from our participant. So we want verbal consent. For the sake of this project, this class project, we are not seeking IRB approval, but we are asking for their verbal consent that they know they're going to be interview recorded. You can assure them that their data will be de-identified, but there will be a recording. And then lastly, we want to use good interview procedures and skills, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Next, let's talk about interview guide development. We want to be able to effectively develop a flexible tool so that we are able to utilize this interview guide or a series of questions across three people fairly flexibly. So we say the word interview guide rather than semi-structured interview or qualitative questionnaire because it insinuates that we're also going to allow for flexibility for the conversation to unfold. So our first job is really to define the objectives of our needs assessment. So what is the purpose of my needs assessment? We need to identify specific information needed, and we really want to align our interview guide individual question with our overall research goals. Next, we need to understand the population. So we need to consider cultural, linguistic, and demographic factors. Recently, I was asked to conduct a needs assessment with 4 different populations of focus. But they were all non-behavioral health professionals. So I interviewed teachers, community leaders. I also interviewed youth that were under the age of 18, but focused kind of on that teenage age group. So one of the things that I had to think about was really adjusting my interview guide to meet each population of focus, right? So the questions that I was asking to teachers were similarly focused, but differently worded than the groups that I ran with teens or the interviews that I did with teens. So I had to think about tailoring those questions to meet the experiences and perspectives of the population of focus. So we really want to make sure we're using inclusive and respectful language as we move through that process. I want to think intentionally about structuring the interview guide. And in the handout that I've created for you for this week's course content, I really have divided the questions into different categories. So we have these opening questions. We're building rapport with our participants. We're sort of easing them in, getting to know them. Then we have our core questions. These are the questions that are really focused on key themes, key objectives, or goals for our projects. And then we have our probing questions. These are questions that we kind of use on the fly when we want to probe for more depth, following up a specific research, a specific core question, I should say. And then lastly, we have our closing questions. So we're trying to summarize and gather final thoughts from our participants before closing the interview. One thing we always want to keep in mind is using open-ended questions. So we do not want questions that will elicit a yes, no response because we want elaboration. We also don't want to ask why questions because what the research on qualitative interviewing shows us is that why questions almost puts the interviewer and interviewee or participant in a power dynamic where we might be questioning them in a way of like they have to justify themselves to us. We never want that to be the case. We want our posturing to be detailed, thoughtful, and avoiding of leading questions or yes or no. We also want to, and this is really in alignment with best practices, pilot and refine our interview guides. That's going to be a part of your class exercises for this week. We want to test our interview guide and then adjust it based on clarity, flow, and participant feedback. We also want to talk about ethical considerations. Some of the things that we want to consider is that we really want to guarantee confidentiality to our participants, meaning that everything that you tell me throughout the course of this interview will not be shared, for example, with your supervisor or organizational directors if you're interviewing clients with their service providers. So we want to talk about that. We also want to talk about informed consent. So this becomes particularly important when we bring out our recording device. We always want to ask consent for our participants to be recorded, and we want to let them know what we're using their data for. And so for that, we want to disclose that we're in a doctoral program. We're using this as a class exercise to develop our needs assessment skills in our program evaluation class. So be super specific about that. We also want to avoid questions that may cause discomfort or harm. A caveat to that would be if you are exploring a sensitive area of inquiry, let's say sexual assault, for example. One of the things that if that is our area of need, let's say we are looking at services that provide counseling for survivors of sexual assault, we're going to want to make it very clear that these are the kinds of topics that we are going to be exploring throughout the interview so that the participants can agree whether or not that's something that they want to participate in or not. We never want to surprise our participants with a topic. We want them to know the purpose of the interview ahead of time, which is really getting to this idea of being not only sensitive to people's boundaries, but also to their time. So we really want to be explicit with our interview participants. Sometimes we're interviewing busy service providers. How long can they give us and plan that ahead of time? Is this a 30-minute interview? Can they give us a 1-hour interview? So we also want to respect people's time. This is a highly flexible approach. We would allow space for participants to guide the conversation, but we want to also be able to adapt based on participants' responses. That's also the beauty of conducting something based on an interview guide, is that sometimes participants answer 2 or 3 questions at the same time. Sometimes they don't go in order. So you want to allow flexibility for the interview to unfold. Next, I want to talk about interviewing skills or maybe facilitation skills. I want you to think about this idea of active listening and challenge yourself to think about, how do I really know somebody is listening to me deeply? And we want to emulate some of those skills. So, a posturing that I like to adopt is known as appreciative inquiry. That's the posturing or the stance that I would like you to take when interacting with participants through needs assessment. And this goes through the process of 4 Ds. So the first D stands for definition. So, this positive focus for inquiry that, regardless of the topic, and sometimes we interview people about very challenging topics, we want this to be positively oriented and focused. The next D, second D, is discovery. We want to inquire into positive moments and to share stories. So we want a process where we're opening up and allowing people to tell us their stories and asking people to share stories. Stories are always a place where we get juicy data because people tell us their meaning making, their actions, their interactions, and how that leads to the next process. The next is dream. So, especially this is important for needs assessment, in my opinion, because we want to think about creating a shared picture about the future. So, we might be identifying a need, a gap in services, but let's try to dream together about what this could be like in the future if we have a new program that we can implement. Last is design and delivery. So that's again thinking about creating a future together. So I kind of like to take my interview guide on an arc when conducting a needs assessment where we're starting out looking at the need, but then we're building up to kind of the future. So, appreciative inquiry has its own interviewing tips. We always want to face the speaker. We always want to ask questions about the context. We're really interested in the nuance and the details. So, the when, the where, the who, the how. We always want to center our participants. Sometimes there's this tendency to maybe connect with our participants by sharing our own personal stories and relationships to the topic at hand. However, that's always something that can be done after the interview. We really want to center their experience, their expertise, and honor their time by doing that. We want to collect details of the journey. So, focusing on status quo or challenging the status quo, barriers, actions, surprisals, reversals, or discoveries. We want to also pause throughout the interview and discover time points that really sum up the narrative and link to deeper meaning. So we want to listen carefully so we can find those summarizing moments where we're briefly retelling their story back to them to let them know we are following, we are listening. So let's take it back from the beginning. We want to think thoughtfully when opening up our interview about um, really setting the stage that's quite open. So, Kathy Sharmaz in her text about interviewing says, we want to start out by saying, can you tell me everything that is involved with X? So, your topic of focus. And often say, like, I'm going to sit here and listen until you unfold all the details or tell me exactly the story that you want me to tell. And I'll sit here and not interrupt until you are finished. So that's it. One strategy for opening up the interview. Kathy Sharmaz also goes on, and this is her book on constructing grounded theory, to talk about these few tips on interviewing that she thinks are essential. She says, one of our main objectives is getting at meaning or meaning making experiences. So her tip on that is to focus in on a key phrase or word that the participant says and then reflect it back to them. So in her study, she was really interested in the concept of slowing down. She had an interviewer, she was interviewing people on the experiences of living with chronic health conditions. And people just said, like, I have to deal with this fact that I'm slowing down. So she says, can you tell me what slowing down means to you? So that's one of her strategies. The next strategy that she gets at is called confirming data. So this is, we all think we're hearing things, we all think that we're following along, but sometimes interviews present opportunities for us to get confirmation. So she says, do you define the greatest difficulty primarily in terms of physical fatigue? So you can also see that's a great strategy in terms of understanding priorities for needs assessments. So people are going to tell us a lot of stories. They're a lot of information, but it's good to check in terms of what is the greatest need that they're having or what is the greatest challenge. Lastly is laying the groundwork for comparison. So Kathy Sharma's in her work often talks about the concept of suffering, and comparing oneself to others is a way that we can kind of get at meaning making through this concept of interaction. So she says, if we find times in our interviews where we can lay the groundwork for comparison, we should do that. That is effective. So she says, how do you compare what suffering you've seen in others to yourself? That also helps us get at, how people are really comparing the needs maybe that are happening within their organization to needs of other organizations within their field. So we should have two major concerns with interviewing. The first is learning. So we're learning from participants' words and meanings. The second is exploring. So we are going to formulate our researchers or research team's area of emerging interest based on the participants' priority. So this is super important for needs assessments because we might think we're going into a community or partnering with a project where we're thinking we are going to uncover a mental health need. And then we might actually be uncovering more of a workforce capacity need. So we want to remain very open at this stage so we can actually identify the greatest needs. So helpful to when interviewing. When someone brings up an area of interest, we want to illuminate it. How do they define it? What does that mean to you? We want to use our participants' very words, their local language. And sometimes when we get stuck, we can use strategies from our other interviews and say, other people in your field have told me that their greatest need is X. How do you feel about that? And so laying the groundwork for comparison is often helpful to elicit more conversation, maybe when the conversation is running dry or not as robust as we would like to be. We want to build results while interviewing, and that might be really hard to think about, but sometimes during our interview, we're actually shaping our results, and that's really that process of iteration that we spoke about earlier. So occasionally, participants will just say something that jumps out, that captures and crystallizes what other people have been telling you all along. But our participants are so brilliant, and sometimes they have their unique words or conceptualization that you're like, that is it. That is the need. So new areas often evolve. So we kind of find new lines of inquiry to pursue, and our interview guide evolves. So I want you to encourage you to do that. We're not in qualitative interviewing, we're not as concerned about fidelity of interview guide implementation as we are about eliciting rich data and having that interview guide really evolve. So I use the example from my own work that I'm really interested in understanding meaning making related to living with HIV. And often what I've found in is that in order to think about the evolution of HIV, I also need to ask people questions about their unique meaning making experiences related to sexual health or substance use disorders alongside meaning making with HIV. So I could start out by asking questions around areas of need related to HIV. And then I learned that what I'm really uncovering is a need to address topics related to substance use or substance use disorders. Okay, so again, if I could leave you with one key tip, it is really that meaning making tip. So, what did that mean to you? So, that is that key phrase that your participant is sharing with you that you really want to hone in on. And your participants will really get used to this skill. So, sometimes they'll say, oh, okay, reflection time again. So, it's really prompting people for deeper reflection about the phrases that they're um, using to describe their situation and needs. So we're going to have two activities for this week. The first is a role play with questions from the interview guide. So I'd like you to review the course content for this week, particularly those three handouts, and do a rough draft of your interview guide that's linked to a research aim. And I would like you to reach out to a classmate, or you could even do this with a peer or maybe even a family member, and practice your interview guide. Do some role play with your with a person in your household or within your social network or professional network. And I want you to answer these questions. So after doing the role play, practicing your interview guide questions, think about challenges, what worked well, what didn't work well, what were the juicy points of nuanced data that came up during that interview or the interview role play. And how could the interviewer more effectively respond to the challenges that presented themselves in the interview? So really challenge yourself and think about your own performance. And then lastly, do any alterations to your questions that you might need to do and record those and reflect on those. Okay, so let's talk about addressing some sticky spots. I would also recommend practicing the consent process, which will actually get us to class activity two. I often find that I most lose people in my studies and my research if I am not smooth with the consent process, if people are skeptical of research or on the fence about whether or not they want to participate. It's typically happens during the consent process. So it's important to be able to talk about consent confidently and accurately. Sometimes participants will not consent, or when in some formal research studies, we have them sign the consent form. Um, so we really want to assure confidence and keep confidence going. One of the things that people question most is, will their data be protected? What mechanisms are you using to not only de-identify their data or protect their data? So having that predefined and a process predefined is really important to be able to communicate, even in a class assignment with non-IRB approved research. We also want to think about responses to personal questions. Sometimes people are really curious as to why we're interested in certain areas of inquiry. Like, for example, why am I a researcher that's interested in HIV? So it's up to us as researchers to think about disclosure of personal stories and to think about how much we want to share ahead of time as researchers as well. So a lot of this is just not being caught off guard. So another sticky challenge that happens in qualitative interviewing is that people often tell you information after the recording device is turned off. So you think you've had this really great interview and you've built a lot of rapport and you've got a lot of good information, then you turn off the recording device and you're kind of cleaning up your stuff and making small talk, and then the participant tells you what's really going on. So we need to think about how to manage this. Oftentimes, I will ask the participant if I can turn the recording device back on. If they're not comfortable with that, I've also asked, well, is it okay if I take some field notes about some of the things that you've shared with me today? So you will notice in your interview guide template that I have an area for additional interviewing notes that are key. Often participants will, or no, I wouldn't say often, but occasionally participants will handle requests outside of the interview. So you also want to think about managing those mindfully and intentionally as well. And sometimes that involves asking you questions that prompt a disclosure. And what I like to do when the recording device is turned on and participants are asking me personal questions, I'll often say, I'm really here to learn about your experience, your expertise, really repositioning them in as the expert, which they are in the interview process, and then say, let's take some time afterwards and I'll tell you a little bit more about me and my relationship to this subject matter. It doesn't always work, but I do would like to share that with you as a way to maybe manage things outside of the scope of the interview. There's been some recent research on the notion of online versus in-person interviewing and how these experiences are different. I can say since the COVID-19 pandemic and the advent of new technologies for interviewing like Zoom and Teams, my work online has really increased. And a lot of the research has shown that a lot of people thrive in anonymity or thrive in online environments and are really open to sharing. So the research really imitates a lot of the research that we know about online therapy in the sense that it is effective and we can get great information as interviewers who are engaging participants online. It's helpful because you can collect a lot of information in less time because it doesn't involve travel, particularly to remote locations. Um, However, there are more distractions. So really ensuring privacy and a space for your participants where you won't be interrupted is important. I would also say minding the chat is key. I've had participants link some really interesting information in the chat during the interview, like, hey, I want to share with you this really cool harm reduction resource that I found. I'm going to just throw it in the chat. So it also provides us avenues for collecting more data. Sometimes people are also more effective at writing rather than speaking. That might be their preferred way of communication. So also being able to utilize the chat is effective. Um, I have found that you have to be extra engaging as an interviewer online. You have to figure out ways to project energy in the room. I would say this is particularly true when running focus groups online, but even with individual interviewing, you want to think about enthusiasm, pacing, responses, and humor as a way to be engaging. And again, some people really thrive in this anonymity. Some people become disengaged online. So again, you have to be flexible in this type of approach. So this brings us to our second activity for the class for this week. We'd like you to practice introducing your study. So this will help focus you on your pitch to participants prior to implementing and engaging with your interview guide. So you're going to talk about your study. You're going to introduce the consent process. You're going to talk about your process of recording and transcribing data and storing data and really make your pitches to why it would be important or valuable for your participants to engage in this interview with you. Now we'd like you to reflect on what challenges were presented, what worked well, what didn't work well, and how you as an interviewer could respond more effectively to the challenges in introducing your study. And then lastly, think about making alterations. So again, role play is so key at this point of interview guide development, conducting intensive interviews and gathering rich and nuanced data from our participants about their needs. Again, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions about interview guide development. And I hope you all have a fantastic time interviewing. Thank you very much. Bye.